Many know many.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam Bugajski, Polish MFA. I'll be brief. I have two comments, one question.
Yes, thank you.
First comment on relationship between Poland and other Central European countries. I would like to say that we are not going to neglect this relationship. It is important and it's going well. There is a very good cooperation, for example, within Visegrad group. We've got a lot of consultations at different level, and I would say that our relations with Slovakia, Hungary and Czech Republic are the best in our history. So, of course, we want to develop relations with France, with Germany, and to strengthen, for example, the Weimar Triangle. But as somebody mentioned, Hillary Clinton, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Second comment, very brief one. I appreciate what Andrew MICHTA said about resourcing the defense European level. I fully agree with that. Question, very easy question, very general question to our to American members of the panel, to Wes MICHTA and to Andrew MICHTA. What kind of policy Poland and other Central European countries should conduct vis-à-vis Russia, especially in the longer term? What policy should be in the interest of Poland and other Central European countries, but also in the interests of larger transatlantic society? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to collect two more questions and then ask for a round of comments. I have Edward Lucas here and Bruce Jackson, and then you in the back and you over there will be in the next round. Thank you. Ed Lucas here first.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think it might be a good idea to just break this down into different bits of the relationship geographically, because I think the idea, we're still very much wedded to the Cold War idea that the America's relationship is anchored in the defense of Central Europe, although the centre's moved a bit further east. And it seems to me if one goes forward 5 years and puts Afghanistan and the contributions to the Afghan mission out of the way, you're going to have, going from north to south, American interests in the high north, where Norway is going to be important, and Russia, so that's sort of transatlantic, though it's also arguably transpolar. You're going to have oil in Israel in the Mediterranean, which is not going to go away, and that will, to some extent, also keep America anchored in the Black Sea and in the security of the Caucasus, Trans-Caucasus oil pipeline. And then if we're lucky, there may be a residual American security commitment to the Baltic states, which is the one lingering hard security place where there's a potential threat. And I just want to refer briefly to the remarks that were made earlier about how it's all over with Russian imperialism. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the Ladoga and Zapad maneuvers this year, and whether, again, they'll be based on a scenario of invading, isolating, and occupying the Baltic states, followed up with nuclear strike in Warsaw, including the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That would be quite an interesting indicator of what the strategic temperature is. But those seem to be the sort of specific theatres, and only really the northern and the southern one seem to be really dependable. There's always going to be an American interest in the Mediterranean, and there's going to be an American interest in the Arctic. And I really wonder in 5 years' time what will be going on in between that will really keep America anchored.
Okay. And Bruce Jackson, please, who's over there. Could you...
Bruce Jackson, Project on Transitional Democracies.
Doesn't matter.
First, I'd like to thank the chairman for kind remarks about fighter planes. If anybody here does not have a personal fighter plane, America has more than we need, and we'll be glad to get to you. And we provide financing. One thing that's striking when we discuss Central and Eastern Europe is the Georgian War always comes up, and sort of what are the lessons of the Georgian War. And you always hear this sort of sense of regret in the background that NATO didn't engage the 58th Army or American forces didn't come in over the horizon. It seems to me that that's sort of part of the lesson of the Georgian War, that's not in the cards. That was never in the cards. Actually, the only people that ever thought it was in the cards might have been the general staff of the Polish army in the interwar period. I mean, we do not want that kind of conflict, and the point is the demilitarization of the post-Soviet space, and that's sort of always been the point. And it seems to me that what it illustrates the Georgian War is the institutions of Europe, beginning with OSCE and the Institute, did not go far enough east. And I think that's why we find ourselves here today talking about things like the Eastern Partnership and a renewed multilateralization of these frozen conflicts that did not occur, since 1989. And that seems to me the lesson of the Georgian War, all the things we did not do since 1989.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can tie these three comments and questions together because I think there's an underlying message here. The message is quite clear, and it's a message from America to Europe. Deal with your own issues. We can't take care of all of your problems because we have bigger issues elsewhere. And I think, for those of us who go to Washington regularly, we hear that from American officials. There are people here from whom I've heard that. And I think that is, in my view, an important message because it's telling us to grow up. It's now 20 years after 89, actually 22. And the American attitude is we have issues in Asia, we have Afghanistan, we have Iraq, which are unresolved, and where we will, all of us, in fact, not just Americans, will stay much longer than 2014. And now we have these upheavals in the Muslim world. And of course, as Andrew was saying earlier, not just we Europeans, but the Americans are massively distracted by polarization at home and by the economic crisis. That means, it seems to me, that the question that Mr. Bugajski raised, what should Polish policy towards Russia be, gets a completely new drive. Because we're the ones who have to resolve these issues. We're the ones who have to resolve the question whether we want a Euro-Poland free. Does that mean we're going to even try to resolve the frozen conflicts? And if so, how? And with whom? And finally, Bruce is entirely right when he points out that it is we Europeans who have failed to flesh out the European institutions who would be able to do that, politically and diplomatically. Who would like to take a first stab at this?
Maybe Wes, you
all
start
of you.
first. And
Wes?
all of them.
Okay, all of you, great. Wes, start.
Yeah, I
please.
think that's. I'll start with Adam's question. And as an American, I mean, I'm hesitant to offer advice, but I think in a word, I would say if I were a Pole looking at the current geopolitical map and looking at the political map in Washington, you've got rapprochement underway. It works in sync with reset in some ways. I would enjoy the sunshine, but invest in umbrellas. I mean, I think it's a weather pattern that I would not predict to last simply because there aren't fundamental interests that unite Poland and Russia or Poland and the United States beyond the deliverables that we're currently looking at. Now, maybe they'll surprise us and we'll see new things, but I think at this point it's a tactic, it's a partial agenda. I don't see a full-fledged long-term strategy. I think engagement in some ways is going to, this will offer some dividends, some strategic dividends to Poland, and you should want that to endure. I think Belarus and the ambiguous status of the post-Soviet space emerging increasingly as sort of a civilizational purgatory will pose a very real problem for rapprochement eventually. In some ways, rapprochement and reset may both break themselves on the rocks of what's going on in the post-Soviet space because it sharpens the distinction between the Western and Russian agendas ultimately for what the post-Soviet space should look like. Even if that eventually goes smoothly at some point over the long term, I would expect that's not a frictionless process. It's going to produce friction. So from a Polish perspective, if I were looking at that, I would just say that I think it's important to balance the investments that are being made in engagement with an effort at building yourself into a position of strength over the long term. I think the more you can embed yourself in European structures, as Polish policy is currently doing, the better. I think the more energy independence you can have, the better. Frankly, one area of criticism would be the more you can use your co-regionals, the other Visegrad states, the better. And I don't see evidence. I disagree with a couple of things that were said on the panel a moment ago. I don't think that the Central Europeans are effectively coordinating policy. And one criticism that I've heard from diplomats from other Visegrad countries is that they often feel left out of the process of the Donors Conference, for example, or Poland taking the lead on Eastern initiatives alongside Western member states. I think they would like more inclusion in that process, and there's a base of strength that Poland is not entirely taking advantage of.
Constanze, could I take a, because, oh.
Okay, fair enough, Andrew. And then I'll come to Marcin and to you.
Just wanted to address what Bruce said, because I think, to me at least, this is arguably one of the most important deliverables of this discussion. Because what are the lessons of the Georgian conflict are precisely what you're saying. The momentum has slowed down to the momentum of what was transpiring in the 1980s and the 1990s and up into 2000. Not that anybody would ever expect the American military intervention, but we were not institutionally prepared to bring, if you will, a greater transparency, and the momentum began to slow down. The danger that I see is that what has become almost a boundary now in Europe, because you're increasingly, if you look at the developments at Belarus, if you look at Ukraine, if you look at what happened in Georgia, there's a perception somehow that we've reached the limit. And I think what we need as a community, and I'm a realist, so I don't like running into institutions too heavily, but I think this is the time to talk about it, to bring NATO and the European institutions into play, to restart that process. That's the first point I'd like to make, and not to take too much of everybody's time here. What Edward said is absolutely right. I mean, we are not having enough conversation about NATO post-Afghanistan. It's in part our fault because we're so mesmerized. Our Norwegian colleagues do this. I see a friend here in the audience. We've had a wonderful discussion of what this alliance should be doing, can be doing post-Afghanistan, and I think that discussion, now that we've done the strategic concept, is long overdue. We should start looking at the things that will bind us once the residue and the resentments, quite frankly, have settled down. The caveats, all sorts of issues that go on. But I think that's the most important thing, that this is not a question of military power. This is the question of the risk of momentum slowing down, boundaries forming, and the risk then of boundaries becoming fault lines. And if we get to that point, I think we're in deep trouble.
Thank you. Marcin.
I just wanted to respond very quickly and shortly to the issue of rapprochement. So perhaps another, this time more Central European take on the issue. I think what is very important about, this rapprochement is something what you mentioned at the beginning, but it must deliver results.
Yeah. What are we getting out of it?
And it's not going to last if it doesn't. And the result that we have at the moment is really about atmospherics. It's about, we resolve some historical issues. It was actually very, very important. I wouldn't underestimate it, because without resolving that, or about beginning to resolve it, actually, we didn't move on. But so we started this process, we're moving on. But on the issues of concrete material interest, nothing has been achieved, really, at this point. When we look into energy security, when we look at frozen conflicts and so on, I don't see a lot of movement there. Which is a little bit worrying, if I can, because as Mr. Lucas said, I think it is absolutely true that the U.S. Interest in Central Eastern Europe is rapidly declining. I see I can't see the end of this tendency at this point.
Can I maybe needle you a little bit on that? Because Tomáš was saying earlier, what can we do if the big powers, if the Americans and the Germans and the French don't achieve anything here? Then we've just heard that the Americans have other fish to fry, larger fish, fish in danger of burning, to stay in the metaphor. I won't beat it to death, don't worry. But that surely means that we need to reconsider this attitude of whether we are pushing enough, whether enough is being done. Now, of course, the Poles are pushing the Germans, and I think with some results, it had to be fair. I also, speaking as a German who watches these processes very carefully, I think known to many of you as not somebody who always has unqualified voices unqualified approval for German foreign policy, but I think it's only fair to say that there has been a real shift in Berlin as regards Eastern policy and Russia. The question for me now is are we pushing enough? Is there enough? And what can we do? Can we have a bit of maybe European self-criticism here? Where have we been lacking? What should we be doing to get this moving, to fill the Eastern Partnership with life, to get results on frozen conflicts and other issues?
Well, I certainly think that, and it's not entirely responding to your question, but I think that what Central Eastern Europeans have been, the lessons they've been drawing from what's been going on in the last few years, is that they increasingly have to act via the EU, and they support increasingly have to go towards strengthening what instruments the European Union has there. Otherwise, they act in the framework which is dominated not by themselves and in which they don't really have a voice. Yeah. As regards, what we can do with the Eastern Partnership, obviously this will be a matter for another discussion here later on. But I think that momentum is not with Eastern Partnership at the moment, really. Right. I mean, now momentum is with the South. Yeah. I think that the way to look at it is try to hinge some of the initiatives towards the East to the momentum that is directed towards the South.
On the momentum, some of you may have seen the non-paper written by the French and 4 or 5 other countries and presented at the last council meeting, which suggested that not just was the momentum somewhere else, but we should move the money somewhere else. And the quote from this, the most famous quote from this memo is, Tunisia gets €1.80 out of the European neighborhood policy. Moldova gets €25. This should change. Now, that, it seems to me, for most of the people in this room, should be a warning sign. Tomáš, would you like to comment on what
I would,
Marcin
but
was
let me also address two other questions really quick. I promise not to take too much time. First, on Russia, I think we got the policy just about right. I cannot think of a better model than a combination of reset and reassurance. Reassurance because it puts our minds at ease in Central Europe because it tightens the transatlantic bond. But I think reset itself has been important, and I disagree with you, Marcin. I think it has already been beneficial. Not in terms of actually necessarily changing hearts and minds in Russia, though the fact that Katyn has been aired on Russian television, I would have thought 6 months ago that completely unthinkable. So clearly something has subtly shifted in Russia. But even more importantly, the fact that Poland has undertaken reset with Russia meant that your image in the eyes of Western Europeans, your image and reputation in the eyes of the Americans has improved. That's important. If our security depends on being seen as a valued and fair member of a broader community, we don't want to be seen as a problem. We don't want to be seen as sort of genetically coded Russophobes. The reset you have had with Russia has already yielded benefits in terms of improving relations with the West. So I think in terms of our Russia policy, we have it about right. In terms of Poland's relations with the rest of Central Europe, we had 2 competing schools of thoughts. One was from the MFA saying everything is nice and dandy. Poland can balance its newfound friendship with Germany and France with its old relationship with new member states. Marcin, you seem to argue differently. You said, well, these regional partnerships have never really worked. I don't know where Poland stands.
Well,
let me tell you where
they haven't worked perfectly.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me tell you how Poland's new policy is seen from the rest of Central Europe. And of course, I can't speak for all of us in Central Europe. But let me tell you how I see it. Let me be very clear on this. And I may be getting in trouble here, but that's all right. I'm not a diplomat. I think that the fact that Poland is now striving to and actually being seen as a real player by France and Germany is unequivocally good for us, for the rest of Central Europe as well. There is no jealousy involved. The reality is, for reasons of history and geography, we worry about the same things that you do. We value the same things that you do. If you can make your priorities Germany's and France's priorities, we all benefit. So let me make that absolutely clear. There's no jealousy involved. That your rise and your newfound prestige is good for us. What we occasionally worry about is whether you're willing and able to balance your new friendships with the old ones. I worry when I hear that the regional dynamic has never really worked. Well, that would be news to the Slovaks, who were completely lost in sort of wild wilderness in the late 1990s. And if it wasn't for Czech interference, for Czech intervention, Václav Havel saying Slovakia is important, we cannot afford to have a black hole in the middle of Europe, we would have taken many more years to get into NATO and the European Union. We have seen the regional partnerships work. We hope that you manage to walk and chew gum at the same time. Not only because it's important for us, I think it makes you, Poland, more valuable to France and Germany. You're valuable to France and Germany because you're a big country. You'll be even more valuable if you are seen as being able to deliver Slovakia, Czech Republic, Romania, and other Central European member states. So that's on the subject of Central Europe. Do you want me to get into Eastern Partnership?
This is, I think, the right time to mention a great phrase used by a friend of mine who's an American historian, Peter Baldwin, who wrote a book called The Narcissism of Minor Difference. I think you know what I mean by this. It's the fact that the policy differences between us, not just within Central Europe, although they exist and we shouldn't deny them. But in fact, the policy differences between Europe are absolutely minimal compared with what we are facing beyond our borders. And it seems to me that that makes the issues that we have to deal with, the resolution of differences, the resolution of the frozen conflicts, and dare I say, finding a relationship with Russia that doesn't always play to Russian elites, but that also looks at and helps and supports Russian civil society. In what I think we must recognize is a search for democratic transformation as well. I think that makes all of that rather more urgent. But with that, enough editorializing from me. I've got more questions in the audience. I've got Genek Smolar, got you, sir, and I have a gentleman over there. Let's take these three, and I haven't forgotten the other ones.
First of all, I love the just now discussion and what you have said. That means I would disagree with my boss Marcin on the way, the dynamics of the Central European mechanism. The fact of the matter is, when you look also at the deliverables, they are very, I would say, insignificant. That means the big guys meet for breakfast before the council meeting. They agree on certain positions. That's good. Also, heads of departments of the ministries talk to each other more than they did before. There is a Polish-Czech forum. There is a Polish-Slovak forum, which is not working very well. There are things happening. But we need to understand that when we start talking real business, for example, let's say the future of our military industries, nothing happens. The small narcissism of the small differences is more than that. There is no interest. There are small monopolies. And there is no political will to deliver some tangible results. So when I look at the scene, Visegrad 4 scene first, I see that much more could have been done, and we could have achieved much more influence vis-à-vis our European partners and also Washington if we would actually tackle those serious issues. There is a problem, for example, of F-16s. Do we all need that? Can we actually create one single space to patrol and to train and God knows what? I mean, there is a lot of things which have been put on the table and not resolved for years. But then there is a broader observation. That means I would say there is a certain regionalization of security policies within Europe. And here is a very interesting phenomenon. That means we shouldn't talk about Visegrad 4. This is a backbone. But you've mentioned Romania and Bulgaria, but also, of course, the Baltic states, if not, as Edward called it in his pieces, extravagant policy of Lithuania for the moment, but we hope it will pass soon. But also there is a Scandinavia. There is a new tendency to look in Sweden and in Finland to look south, to the extent, to my amazement, that the Foreign Relations Committee asked the government of Sweden whether a military pact between Sweden and Poland is imaginable. That's last week news. But the fact is that they concentrate their minds on the regional aspect of policy is very important, and I'm sure it would be of interest to the US of A. Because we take care of our own backyard and our own business. And I don't think that we have a role to play. We could, but I don't think we have a role to play in solving the frozen conflict. What we could solve, and this is of a major importance, is our relations with Russia. And here we are playing a much more down-to-earth game with Germany and with others. That means we are smiling, we are talking, but we cannot deliver the tangible result. That will come from Washington, Moscow, and from the NATO Moscow discussions. What we can do is not to spoil the game. We can let them be at peace with themselves and go through the motion of negotiation adaptation, mainly on CFE, nuclear, tactical nuclear, future tactical nuclear arms. This is the real thing. Confidence-building measures. We can deliver confidence-building measures. We wait for Moscow. And one thing which is, I think, very important, and it's to Oksana, but it somehow relates to it, is why there was no intervention lately by Russia. Because West was not interested. Would the West put its army, would show interest in Central Asia by actually intervening there, I think Russia would be forced to do it. So we are in a very interesting period of adaptation and negotiation of relationship. And of course, Georgia paid the price.
Okay, thank you. With that, I would like to go to the gentleman over there who has been waiting for a while. And then I'm come to you.
I'm Guo Xiaoping from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, a think tank based in Beijing, China.
Can you speak a little louder? Or hold it closer. Yeah. Thank you. Just closer to your mouth.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, perfect.
many speakers talk about the increasing presence of China around the globe and in this region. I think that's a fact. Last week, China, for the first time in history, sent a naval vessel to Mediterranean to help our citizens to leave Libya. And in this week, China will send 4 airplanes to help more Chinese laborers leave Libya. I think we can have more cooperation on security issues. For example, we have already cooperated to fight against pirates in East Africa area, fight against Somalian pirates. And we also actually cooperate to help Afghanistan to establish effective government and purpose economy, trying to give assistance to them. I have a question for Thomas. From the perspective of Central Europe, what kind of challenges and opportunities was caused by the increasing presence of China? And if you have some concern about caused by China's increasing presence, what you expect China to do to alleviate that kind of concern? Thank you.
Thank you. This is also, I think, a sign of changing times. I think at earlier Central European conference you wouldn't have had a question from China. Now we have a gentleman over there who wanted, and then by the way, I'm going to. All right, I will take one fourth question over there, and then I'm going to close this because we only have 5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask panelists to address your questions and also at the same time make their final statements. So,
thank you, Madame. Jacques Rosier from Belgium. I am very happy to be here in Central Europe and to understand a little bit more on the Visegrad countries' relationship. Coming from a Benelux country, I have understood that Visegrad is on issues-related topics. But when I heard our Polish panelist speaking about the Weimar Triangle, when I could understand what was the Eastern Partnership for the rest of the Visegrad countries, I think there is a problem for what you aim at the Weimar Triangle going to Germany and France in CSDP. So my question related to the topic of this panel, transatlantic relations, the role of Central Europe, is the Weimar Triangle exercise you are doing a way to get closer to UK through the treaty that France and UK have signed? So that would be more in NATO framework. Or is it to get closer to France and Germany? France, a big military player, Germany, a big economical player, and to make something in Europe? Or is it a way, because you're not believing in what is called in the Lisbon Treaty permanent structured cooperation, where smaller countries could be inclusive in cooperation? And in doing so, the smaller countries of the Visegrad constellation might find themselves out of the game.
Okay. The gentleman there, and then Oksana, whom I overlooked because she was in my blind spot. But then we'll close it. No, don't shout, please, don't shout. Because we're recording and you do want to be on the mic. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, this is live streaming. I'm sorry, that's what I meant with recording.
Thank you very much. My name is Rem Korteweg from the Netherlands, and it's been very fascinating to be here to understand a little bit more about the Central European security perspective. On that note, 2 quick questions. I've heard a lot about how Central European countries are in NATO for Article 5 and how the Russian-Georgian war influenced strongly the security perspective going into the discussions over the new NATO strategic concept. I've also heard WESS talk about reassurance measures. My question is, when will Central Europe be reassured enough? And that is a problem we should talk about over the coffee. But when will Central Europe be reassured enough? Really? Because the Russian-Georgian war was with Georgia, non-NATO member state. I would say from a Central European point of view, perhaps, well, NATO actually worked because you weren't invaded. Secondly,
Okay.
Jim Jones, the former national security advisor to the United States, said, "Strategy without resources is hallucination." Now, there's a lot of hallucinating going on these days. If you read the new NATO strategic concept, it says one sentence about resources. NATO member states will supply sufficient resources, period. The day before, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen said that Europe risks becoming a paper tiger. Now, what are Central European initiatives to perhaps enhance defense cooperation to live in this age of austerity with 40% declines in defense budgets going around?
Okay, thank you very much. Last question goes to Oksana Antonenko.
Yes, this is not really a question, it's a comment to WESS. I was really worried about your recommendations to Poland. And the reason why I'm worried is because reconciliation between Russia and Poland is not a transactional relationship. It might one day become a transactional relationship. We're not there yet. But it's the idea of actually bringing normalcy in the relationship in which transactional relationship could become possible. And it is a very long and painful and difficult way in progress. And I think the idea of a kind of tactical reconciliation that you recommended, or let's just reconcile now and maybe tomorrow we'll do something else, is not the right approach. What I think is needed very desperately, something which we have not done for 20 years in Central and Eastern Europe, is a mutual reassurances from both sides. And I think, believe me, not only that the Central Europeans need to be reassured about Russia, the Russians have to be also reassured that the Central Europeans also understand the challenges that Russia is facing in its relationship with Europe, and it's also prepared to play a constructive role. And I think that is the dialogue which we need to engage in.
Okay. With that, I'm going to ask my panelists, because we are drawing close to our end time, I'm going to ask my panelists in reverse order to answer the questions that they want to answer, and to answer all the other ones over coffee or whiskey in the course of the day. And I'll start with Andrew.
I will try to address only 3 questions and disregard the rest of them arrogantly, because we have no time, and we can talk after the break. I will not try to presume what the Visegrad versus Weimar should be. This is really not my area. I don't think I would add anything meaningful here. I would like to say 3 things. One is on NATO. I remember a conference that Gienek organized at the Royal Castle in Warsaw. It was one of the first shows with the new Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, and the Foreign Minister Sikorski and the Defense Minister Klich were on the panel, and it was a speech in which Rasmussen was talking about the ever-widening range of tasks that NATO ought to be performed, even a role in responding to global warming crises generated by the changing environment and whatnot. My suggestion to how to focus our debate is to maybe go the other way and ask ourselves what NATO should not be doing. Maybe this is a time, after the new strategic concept, after the kind of reassurance that we've had, considering that we are tired, preoccupied on the U.S. side, let's try to focus on the core business of what we want to do with each other and leave more fuel-efficient tanks kind of aside, because I don't think that's going to help us. The second point is I would like to slightly disagree with what our chairperson said on one point. CONSTANZE said that we will likely see a steadily decline U.S. interests in Central Europe. I think long-term you're right. I think we have to give some credit for what's going on to the nature of the administration that's currently in power in the United States. I mean, the Central Europeans remember a different time with a different administration. And I'm not saying that if the Republicans come into office, things will change, but there will be fluctuations depending on how things develop. So maybe the trend is moving in the general directions, but I think the kind of spikes that we have seen, where sometimes at conferences in Washington people talk about allies as if they were partners, I think that's a product of a particular moment in our history. And the last comment to our Chinese friend, I think you already see the results, indirect results, of the role your country plays. You're the principal supplier of capital to purchase U.S. Treasury notes. You are engaging us in ways that are going to restructure our relationship with you, I think, quite dramatically in the coming decade. Hopefully in positive ways, not all of them positive. And that, I think, in a way, that's the direct answer to my question, draws our attention from the region that once used to be our preoccupation, not just Central Europe, but in effect Europe as a whole.
Okay. Marcin.
Okay, very briefly, three main issues that were being relevant to what I was saying before. I don't want to be misunderstood on this issue that we somehow are replacing focus on V4 with a focus on Weimar Triangle. That's not the issue. That's not at all. And I completely agree with my colleague from the Foreign Office that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, though I'm a little bit less optimistic, I'm a little bit more less optimistic about the assessment of how effective V4 has been, really. I think on some issues, like I said, climate, for example, has been a very effective coalition. On bringing us to the EU, NATO has been very effective. On the Lisbon Treaty, for example, it hasn't been. We completely fell out. We had different views on that, and it didn't work. But there are also combinations of other variety. For example, on Eastern Partnership, we have worked very closely with Sweden and Czech Republic. On Belarus, we work with Sweden, Germany, and Czech Republic again. So there are various coalitions of interest on different issues. As it's
coalitions of the willing.
Coalitions of the willing, if you like. So it doesn't really need to be and Weimar Triangle, as beautiful as it is also very short on delivery, frankly, at this point. It does remain a very hopeful structure rather than a structure that is delivering. On the issue of the number two, on the issue of CSDP, Weimar Triangle, I think CSDP in the history has moved forward when you had coalitions of 2-3 states pushing it forward. And that is what this is what San Malo was about. This is what the Franco-German-Polish initiative might be about if we are lucky, if atmospheric is right, if our French friends and our German friends don't change their mind on the issue. And I think it is very good, if it does work, it is actually very good for small member states. Because one of the points that is down in the proposal is headquarters for planning operations, which is something that smaller member states, but also Poland, really needs because we don't have our own. This is something that smaller member states would particularly benefit from if the EU does have these headquarters. And finally, on the last point, when the Central Europeans will be reassured enough. Frankly, I'm a little bit puzzled and surprised about the question. It's been only 20 years since the end of communism. Many of us, myself included, do remember communism pretty well. We do remember Russian forces there. We do remember oppressive regimes. It hasn't been such a long time. On top of that, we also had a Georgia war, which only happened 3 years ago. I sometimes talk to my Danish friends, which are talking about how they are afraid of Germany. And that has been like, 60 years ago, right? So, with all due respect, I think that, that we still have a little bit of time to go before we become fully reassured.
I knew this was going to get back to Germany at some point. Okay, we're used to it.
And on defense budget, for Poland is one of the very few member states which does spend around 2% of its GDP.
Thank you. Tomáš, your turn.
Well, 3 points telegraphically. On China, what do the Central Europeans think? The answer is not much. And I don't want to be facetious about it. The reality is the capacity of the foreign policy establishments to juggle too many balls at the same time is limited. China is not a factor in our key priorities, energy security, eastern neighborhoods, or the openness of European economies. Therefore, we don't spend much time on it. China is a major factor in a few global issues on which we do have a view. Obviously, Central Europeans can be counted on to support EU taking a stance in favor of free global flow of goods and trades. Our economies are very open. We will be siding with open market economies, and we'll try to bring a pressure on China to make sure that it remains so. You can also count on us, frankly, to be skeptical about lifting the arms embargo. The transatlantic relationship is dear to us, and therefore you will not you find limited support within Central Europe for lifting the EU arms embargo on China. Rem's excellent question, to which Marcin has partly answered already. Can Europe ever be reassured? Well, first of all, Marcin is absolutely right to say where you stand depends on where you sit. The reality is, by nature, the Dutch will worry about different things about the Central Europeans. That's the nature of a new NATO. Don't knock it. It's like telling the Spaniards not to worry about, not to be so obsessed about Central America, or telling the Norwegians not to worry about the Russians. The reality is, we will always have different security perspectives. I also disagree with the implicit assumption that there's no amount of reassurance that will ever be enough. The reality is, what we have done already has worked. If you spend as much time at Central European Fora as many of us in the room do, you will see a marked difference between the tone of the debates a year and a half ago and now. There's still a lot of worry about Russia, but a lot more relaxed attitude about NATO's and EU's commitments. What we have done already has worked. It has been working. And last question, Rem, what are the Central Europeans doing to enhance defense cooperation? The answer is short, a lot. I acknowledge, I'll be the first one to say we have a defense budget problem, and I fight these battles domestically within Slovakia. But that's not to say that we're happy with it, or they were content, or they were going to sit back and freeload. The reality is there is a very busy dialogue that the Czechs and Slovaks are engaged in, that we hope the Poles and others may join at some point later, on how we can pool some of our things like military education, possibly even supersonic fleet, logistics. And I'm also happy to say that some of our work is indirectly funded by the Dutch government, because I have a large grant from your MFA, which has allowed me to do, among other things, to advise our own defense minister on the subject. So yes, we're doing a lot, some of it with your help.
Wes.
Well, in the interest of time, I won't respond to everything that was raised. I'll just respond to Oksana.
I would stop you from that.
And thank you for your question, Oksana. I want to be sure that I wasn't misunderstood. I was not counseling our wonderful ally Poland in a course of tactical reconciliation. I was counseling them to moderate their expectations that anything beyond the tactical is possible in this rapprochement. I would say my view is hopefulness that rapprochement and reset might deliver something, since we're so far downstream in investing in this policy, but open and full-fledged skepticism that a fundamental rapprochement or normalization is possible as long as Russia is ruled by an authoritarian regime. Full stop. With that, my closing comment would be, in terms of maybe ending on a positive note, that the role for Central Europe, looking at where we're at on the map, is, I think for all of us as a transatlantic community, is to say, after coming through a very long period of introspection and lack of confidence in our own institutions and ideals, to reignite the process of completing Europe and a Europe whole and free. I mean, Belarus shows it very clearly. I think Ukraine shows it very clearly. We have unfinished business in the East. Yeah. And the United States and Central Europe share no more fundamental interests, or the United States and Europe, for that matter, share no more fundamental interests or values than to see this not become a zone of instability that self-Finlandizes itself and then is co-opted and becomes less free. So I think we have the advantage of clarity, moral clarity in what our goal should be, and we should organize our policies towards that end. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think precisely because the Chinas of the world are playing more on the global stage and offer a model, just like the Russians do, of a very different notion of a social contract that's centered on state capitalism and sovereign democracy, Central Europe is vital because it shows that the ideals and institutions of the West still work. And that's why we need Central Europe to be good transitional models to would-be Democrats in the post-Soviet space and in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just like to end this on a note that continues what Wes has just said. I think we've heard through this 1.5 hour conversation on the panel and with the public that we can no longer expect other people to solve our problems for us, neither as Europeans in general nor as Central Europeans in particular. And we are very much the masters of our own destiny. And as Wes has said, it's a destiny that remains unaccomplished, unfinished. The other thing is, the other point made here very clearly with the references to distraction by other crises, by seismic, by tectonic shifts and political earthquakes, is that the price of inaction is very high. Because if we do not find a way to cohere now, to deal with our unfinished business, it will probably remain unfinished for the foreseeable future. And I think that, if I may quote my foreign minister, on one of the things that I think he got right, he did say that it was the task of our generation to fulfill the Europe whole and free agenda. And I think I have to support him on that. Of course, you don't have to listen to me. I was on a trip through Eastern Europe last week, through Chisinau, Kiev, and Georgia, and I was called a classic American-style neocon in Kiev and a Weasley European in Georgia. So, what does it matter what I say? But I would, however, apart from urging you to ignore me, like you to help me thank my 4 panelists who I think did a wonderful job of laying out the issue.